Hi, everybody. Just wanted to draw your attention to the stage. We'd like to begin. Good afternoon. My name is Elan Journo. I work at the Ayn Rand Institute. I'm pleased to welcome you to this panel to celebrate the new book, Foundations of Free Society. You can see it up on the screen. Reflections on Ayn Rand's Political Philosophy. This panel is co-hosted with the Anthem Foundation for Objectivist Scholarship. And I want to recognize some of you in the audience who are supporters of the Anthem Foundation. Thank you for your support, which has enabled some of the scholarship and workshops that went into the thinking that resulted in some of the chapters in this book. So you helped to enable this important new book to come about. So thank you for that. Let me introduce today's panelists. You can read more about them in the OCON app, but I'm just going to do a very brief intro. So at the far end of the stage is Dr. Greg Salmieri. He is an Anthem Foundation Fellow in Philosophy and an instructor in philosophy at Rutgers University. Next to him is Dr. Harry Binswanger, who was an associate of Ayn Rand and the author most recently of a book on epistemology called How We Know. Next to him is Dr. Onkar Ghate. He's a senior fellow and chief philosophy officer at the Ayn Rand Institute. And right next to me is Dr. Robert Mayhew. He is a philosophy professor at Seton Hall University. And Robert and Greg are the co-authors of the book, as you can see from the cover. So, well, thank you all for joining us today. So the format is I have a few questions I want to draw out from the panelists, and then we'll turn it over to you if you have questions, you want to raise some issues that you hear about that you're interested in. So let me start, and this is mainly directed to you, Greg. Maybe, Harry, you want to chime in on this. So there's a comment you have in the introduction to the book about Ayn Rand's cultural impact and the fact that she has energized people about capitalism and the value of it. And I think some of you in the audience may have experienced this in your own life. Maybe this is part of why you come to appreciate capitalism. I want to ask you to just elaborate on that. But so there's a view that I've heard from people who are not fans of Ayn Rand. Sometimes they're detractors. And their view of her influence is, I think, different from yours. So there's actually a book on this premise, which is the view that Ayn Rand isn't just influential. She is the motive power behind the Republican Party. She is this, I'm not making this up. There's actually a book with this premise. And some of you are laughing, and it'd be interesting to explore that. The idea that she's this, the core influence behind sort of the conservative Republican phenomenon as we see today. I don't think that's really credible, but I'm interested, Greg, so what do you see as her cultural influence in advancing the ideas of capitalism, and how do you see it contrasted with the view that I just characterized?
Yeah.
Let's make sure the mic is on.
The mic on?
Yes.
I mean, you might say, 2 times every 5 years a Republican says something good, and when they do, it's Ayn Rand influence. So, yeah, there's a, insofar as there is on the right, and it's tentative and steadily slipping among people who see themselves as on the right, any kind of appreciation or valuing of freedom. I think that Ayn Rand's influence is a very large part of that. And you can tell that by the fact that they cite her when they talk about her. Now, it's hard to tell how much apart compared to the 1 or 2 other people who had influence here, but I think a significant part and a bigger part among real people, so to speak, than among politicians who it's hard to tell what species they are, who value freedom insofar as they do. And especially big among, I think, business people who are the ones who, value, who value capitalism in their life and in living it. I think there's a lot of love for her in that community. The leftist narrative you get, which has actually made me wonder if Rand's influence, one of the things that's made me wonder if Rand's influence is larger than I had thought in this more subtle way, is there's this leftist narrative that the culture, everything was going well in the 50s and 60s. Post-war, we had egalitarianism and growing social welfare state and so forth. And sometimes in the 70s, we swung to this radical Randian capitalism. And then everything went to hell in a handbasket. And now everything's awful, as they think it obviously is, and we need to change back to being like things were in the 60s. Now, interestingly, that fits kind of well with Rand's own values-switched assessment of what was going on. She thought and Harry, you were around this time and wrote them on this, she thought, particularly with the defeat of McGovern, there was a huge shift away from the kind of leftist ideology that had been dominant in the 50s and 60s and into the early 70s. She thought that she did have a significant influence on that, although it was hard, I think, for her also to assess how much. And an influence on the people seeing what was wrong with that, rejecting it, some people standing up to it morally. And there was a lot of deregulation under Ford and Carter and some under Reagan and Clinton. And although we're not in the laissez-fairest dog-eat-dog world that leftists imagine we've been in, Silicon Valley started, and all of our lives are incredibly better because of those kind of giants of industry and others in other fields. But Silicon Valley is the real epicenter of it. And that wouldn't have been possible without that easing up of government intervention in the economy. And she had a role in that. But what's sad, and she had a big role in many of the entrepreneurs there. What's sad, though, is that in a way, her influence is broad, and in a way it's deep, but it's not articulately deep. So I think a lot of people were inspired to love capitalism, to appreciate businessmen, not enough people, but some, and some businessmen to appreciate themselves and have backbone by her. But they were moved by the artistic portrayal. They were moved by elements of the philosophy in the essays that they didn't do the work to understand deeply enough. And so when you ask them, why do you like this? They'll mention Ayn Rand, and they'll also throw out a bunch of bromides. And you get that among the conservatives, and in a different way, you get it among the libertarians. Some people in each group, not all of them. Some are better than that, and some are worse than that. But I think that's a widespread phenomena. And this book is addressed in part to those kinds of people whose love of freedom and of capitalism was kindled in some sense by Ayn Rand, and who don't really understand about what she said did that, and have tried since to defend and articulate it in too conventional terms. Or people who are young and first being kindled by Ayn Rand and are at risk of growing into those kind of older people if they don't identify more what it is in this philosophy and in this art that's making them see the value of freedom.
I think the influence of Ayn Rand in the culture is the following. The reason we got rid of the draft, the military draft, when we did, was that Nixon appointed Martin Anderson to be his advisor. Martin Anderson was tantamount to an objectivist. He had read Ayn Rand and agreed with it. And I think that's why he made the draft an issue, because he started out as a typical liberal back when there were liberals instead of the regressives. He was a typical liberal, and he got converted to pro-capitalism by reading Ayn Rand. And he was spearheaded the movement to end the draft. So that was a huge influence. The other thing is, despite its mixed, or not underplaying its mixed nature, the libertarian movement owes, 75% of its existence to Ayn Rand. There was no libertarian movement before Ayn Rand. There was a book written with the title, it usually starts with Ayn Rand, about the libertarian movement. John Hospers, of course, was a personal friend of Ayn Rand until he betrayed her and she broke with him. And he was important in the libertarian movement. And just about everybody in the libertarian movement was inspired, at least, by reading Atlas Shrugged. So I think the whole libertarian movement would not be a blip on the national screen if it weren't for Ayn Rand. So I think that's a huge thing. And the place where I don't see the influence of Ayn Rand is the place where we need it the most, which is in the universities, in the faculty in the universities. True, there's less antagonism to Ayn Rand now, far less than there was in the 60s. But there's no penetration of the ideas. So that's where I think we have to use, in effect, the libertarian movement as the model and find some area, probably egoism versus altruism, where we can get a movement going in the universities based upon Ayn Rand's ideas on the foundations of ethics.
So I have another question I want to put to you guys. So we run a student conference. We have done for a few years. And one of the things that happens is we attract students who are very new to Ayn Rand. And at one of the meal times or the question periods, I forget when it was, not one, but several students had the same question, which was, so I get that Ayn Rand is for capitalism. I'm all for it. I know a little bit about Hayek, and I know Milton Friedman. I like Uncle Milty, as some of the young people are calling him now. But how does she differ for them? What's special about Ayn Rand's case for capitalism? And one of the things I really appreciate about this book is it offers that kind of student a path to finding the answer. So maybe Greg or Onkar, you can chime in on this. So how would you summarize just some of the features of how Ayn Rand is distinctive in her case for capitalism relative to say, Friedman or Hayek or other thinkers that people are familiar with?
I think I don't think this will be news to this audience. I hope, at least, that she's interested in the philosophical foundations of liberty, and that the birth of liberty came from a philosophical perspective. That philosophical perspective had many virtues and many defects. And those defects were exploited by the enemies of liberty and the enemies of capitalism. And so what it means to restore freedom is to put it on a foundation that it never had. And that's part of, I think, what the title of the book is getting at. And it's both a moral foundation. So the issue of a full-fledged, unapologetic case for egoism, or put it in the American terms, for the pursuit of your own individual happiness. And without a case for that, and you can put it as a defense, but it's really, there has never been a philosophical case for it. So it's the first case where it argued down to philosophical fundamentals that you get from Ayn Rand, and the crucial link of morality to reason, and that what she's providing is a morality of reason, where the value of reason is the top value in the morality. And to understand that what politics is trying to do and what government is trying to do, if it's a system of objectivity, it's to make that it possible to create the freedom in which the mind can function. And she has the clearest understanding of that. The Enlightenment has a lot of understanding about that, and a lot of problems about both what reason is and when you're taking actions that make the function or the exercise of reason impossible. And I mean, we could go into details. We probably will.
Yeah. So did you want to add to that, Greg?
To some of the figures Elan named, Hayek and Friedman are not philosophers. Friedman isn't and doesn't try to be. Hayek is a little more broad. I mean, Friedman's just an economist. Hayek delves into some things that are nearer to philosophy, but I don't think he's a philosopher. And when he delves into those things, he does it a lot less well. The same goes for von Mises, who is, probably the most significant figure of the Austrian school. But this book addresses the philosophical commonalities and differences of these people. The book addresses the philosophical commonalities and differences between Rand and these well-known advocates of capitalism, insofar as they approach philosophy. So there is, or there's direct philosophical relevance to their views. So there's a chapter by Rob Tarr on the several chapters dealing with Austrian economics, but the central one and the one that's most significant is a really, I think, groundbreaking new piece by Rob Tarr on the theory of value behind Austrian economics and how it relates to Ayn Rand's view that value is objective rather than subjective or intrinsic. Hayek, von Mises are Austrian economists, and people may know they speak about values being subjective, and yet Rob argues that what they mean by subjective there is a kind of package deal. But the core insights of Austrian economics depend on the idea of value being objective. And part of the time what they mean by subjective is what we mean by objective, but a lot of the time it's really subjective. And that's when the theory, the school goes a bit off the rails sometimes. So that piece I think is really fascinating. It's a deep read of Menger and von Mises especially, and the connection to Rand, a lot new in there. There's not as much on Friedman, I think, because he's less philosophical. But when we think of the real philosophers who have written on these issues and who were or are taken to be defenders of freedom, we think in the classical liberal tradition of people like Locke. We think of the founding fathers. We think of John Stuart Mill, who's seen as a classical liberal. And in contemporary times, or more contemporary times, we think of Robert Nozick, who is probably the best and most eloquent of the libertarian philosophers. And there's a lot of material in this book on those people. So Darrell Wright's chapters, which I hope we'll get to talk more about later, engage a lot with the Lockean tradition. That comes up in a chapter that Ankar wrote on free speech. There's a chapter by Bob Garmong, and Church and State, yes. There's a chapter by Bob Garmong dealing with this tradition and how Mill is a sort of nadir of it, a departure from the essence of it that we find in Locke and again in Rand, in reinvigorated form in Rand. And also there's a fantastic chapter by Ankar on Nozick, Rand and Nozick, a chapter by Lester Hunt on this subject, and one that goes deeper and is more an extensive chapter by Ankar talking about, in particular, what's different between Rand and Nozick and their approach to these issues. And I don't know if you want to say a bit about that.
Well, I want to get to that in a moment, but so
Okay.
I want to pick up on one of the things you said, Ankar, and get into some of the material that is covered in Darrell Wright's 3 chapters. You said some of the material it goes to sort of the heart of Ayn Rand's defense of capitalism. And so how many people here have read Atlas Shrugged, by show of hands? That's one of the things I love about these events. You can ask that question. Most of the hands go up. That's great. And those of you who haven't read it yet.
So we can count, though.
What's that?
They haven't kept them up so we can count.
Well, I took it as... I was just going to say, for those of you who didn't raise your hands, you've got a real wonderful experience ahead of you when you read Atlas Shrugged, which I encourage you to do. The reason I ask that is a central part of the story, is the role of the mind in human life. So I want to just... Darrell isn't here to talk about his chapter. Maybe if you guys can say a bit about the role of reason in Rand's defense of capitalism, what place does that have, and what kind of issues does Darrell touch on, so that people, I don't know how many people have bought the book, but one of the things I want them to get from this presentation is all the reasons, or some of the reasons why they should and should sort of investigate this further. So just sort of an overview of what is the place of this issue in her defense of capitalism, and what are some of the issues, some of the hard issues that Darrell takes on?
As a preface I'll leave it to the others to talk more about it, since they're more into those philosophical issues. But as a preface, I think on Darrell's behalf, because he resisted this move a little bit, it was originally meant to be 1 chapter. And the only chapter under part 1 of the volume, the press didn't like that. You can't have 1 long chapter under 1 part. There has to be more than 1 chapter. So we, and especially Greg, and talking to Darrell, came up with these 3 chapters. But I think Darrell wants it to be kept in mind that this really is 3 parts of 1 work, not 3 chapters, however otherwise related. But
We tried to just get rid of part headings, but then we can't have 1 chapter that's so much longer than the others, so we're told. The Darrell chapter has an interesting history. A lot of the pieces in this book began as presentations to the Ayn Rand Society, and we'll talk more about that later. And Darrell had a paper called Reason and Freedom that he presented maybe in the early 90s, 97, so late 90s, to the Ayn Rand Society. And it was a normal-sized paper, like some of the other ones you might find in the book. And it was interesting. And but in the 99 Objectivist Conference, which was the first conference I went to, he gave a course called Reason and Freedom, which was an elaboration of this paper, a lot longer. We used to have 6-session, hour-and-a-half courses back then. I forget if his was 6 or 4, but it was a long, extended course on Reason and Freedom. And it was really, for me, the highlight of that conference. And that's saying a lot because there were a lot of really good presentations. Harry did a talk on free will that was fantastic. Ankar, a course on concepts. But anyway, this was the first conference I went to. And it was a really, I found that course extremely illuminating. And what he does is he explores the idea that force paralyzes and negates the mind. What does that mean? What are the needs of the mind? In what way does freedom enable the mind to function? And just in tremendous detail. And I've been kind of wanting him to do something with it ever since. He never did. He had other projects he was working on and is. And when we were doing a book on politics, we can't have it come out without a paper by Darrell based on this. And it took quite a lot of convincing. I had to get someone to transcribe the course, to point out to him how good it is. And then he was going to make a few changes to it, and it was going to come out. And it came out as this basically monograph that was, again, as much better as the talk. The course was way better than the talk. This now new paper was that much, again, better than the course. Really, I think, insightful, a lot of new content, a really deep dive on this. And if you've thought about this issue, what does it mean for force to paralyze the mind? Paralyze and negate, what are those two terms? Yeah, but I mean, can't you really think when there's a gun at you? After all, you can think about how to fight back against the guy with the gun. What does she mean by this? What's the relevance of it to politics? This piece by Darrell, this basically monograph by him, is a tour de force on this issue, and I think really a must-read by anyone interested in Ayn Rand's ethics or political philosophy. Anyone interested in studying it. So we got this giant thing that was the beginning of the book. The press gave us a lot of trouble with it. There was a lot of negotiation between us and the press and us and Darrell about could we cut it, could I cut it, or could I find a way to divide it into 3. Eventually, I found a way to divide it into 3 and convinced him it would work. And Robert and I kind of did some of the implementation, and Darrell then tinkered around the edges of the divisions. And we got what I think are 3 complementary essays that form a whole, like chapters of a book. And you can think of it as a monograph to start off this collection by Darrell.
Ayn Rand on reason in relation to capitalism. The case for capitalism is only this: force is anti-mind, therefore anti-life. That's it. Nobody else comes close in grasping any of that. And yet that is the case for capitalism. There is no other. Thank you. I also want to second what Greg said about Rob Tarr. Some of you are interested in Austrian economics. You may not be fantastic, super experts in Austrian economics, but any of you who have actually read a good deal of Mises and like it and enjoy thinking about economics, you must read Rob's article. It's historic. It shows the connection between objectivism and Austrian economics. What is right in Austrian economics and what is wrong. Wrong philosophically. I don't think there's any criticism of the economics qua economics. It's an absolute requirement for anyone aspiring to the title of intellectual. That's a line from the Fountainhead that Tui used.
Yeah, a couple comments in response. I too, the article on Austrian economics is one of my favorite. It's one of the ones I learned the most. And I must say, if we could pat ourselves on the back, these, as you can hear from the case of Darrell Wright, they don't fall on our laps and we have to tinker with them. This was a case where we really worked to get this chapter out of Rob. And so I'm really proud of the fact that it's in there because of that. Now, the second thing I wanted to mention, just the force in mind, or the 3 chapters, by Daryl Wright. A couple things that I especially liked. He takes the work of this Polish poet, Czesław Miłosz, The Captive Mind, and in a fair amount of detail, he applies Ayn Rand's point about force and the mind to the life of this author, and I find it very effective. I was also very pleased that he managed to discuss Ayn Rand on squirms in connection with this topic. And, well, if you don't know what that means.
Well, what does that mean, just for the benefit?
Squirms was, Ayn Rand talked about that in the course she gave on fiction writing and on nonfiction writing. It's a state of the consciousness in which, sorry, I'm being inconsistent. That's not a virtue in our code, is it? It's a state in which it's like writer's block, but it's a much more profound conception of that. And it can be created by certain circumstances in the life of a writer, but it can also be created by living in Czechoslovakia and under the Soviet Union. And he discusses these things very effectively, I think.
Onkar, did you want to add to any of this? Okay, so I want to turn to you and talk. So how many people, by a show of hands, and please leave them up so we can count, have heard of Robert Nozick before? Quite a few. Robert Nozick. Okay, that's good. So for those who haven't heard, just a word about who he was, and then who is he, why is he significant, and then more on the substance of, so what are you arguing in your paper in relation to Nozick's view of capitalism and freedom?
So Robert Nozick was a professor of philosophy. He was at Harvard. He wrote Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which is, in some ways, you can view as his answer to John Rawls' The Theory of Justice. And now often in political philosophy, you'll be taught these two books together, and he'll be taken as the representative of the free society of individual rights as against Rawls. I mean, that's how I was taught. I was taught in graduate school the course on political philosophy. Basically, these two books. And he makes reference to Ayn Rand in Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Some of her work, I think, Atlas Shrugged, The Virtue of Selfishness, and I forget if Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal is listed in the bibliography. And there's many things that are good in his approach, but many things I think that are bad, and ways in which Ayn Rand is fundamentally different. And part of the goal of the book is the goal of the essay is to get out the way that Ayn Rand is different. So don't treat Nozick as a more sophisticated presentation of Ayn Rand's ideas put in more academic garb. It's just a different approach to the whole conception of rights. And you should teach, if you're interested in these issues and you want to teach these issues, you should teach Rand and Nozick together and draw out some of what's similar about them, but draw out some of what is fundamentally different about it, and that they can there's different approaches to a free society. And the essay, my essay, focuses particularly on the conception of rights and what it means to think of rights as at the foundation of as a political foundation, or the foundation of a proper society or of a free society. And the emphasis that I think is underappreciated about Ayn Rand's approach, that it is very historically informed, and it's focused on what the actual problems that people are grappling with in the Enlightenment period, and the political thinkers of the Enlightenment period are grappling with in trying to think what a better form of government would be, and what it means. One of the ways to think about it, I think, is, and I think I said this on some panel before at the conference, that the central question in political philosophy is how to subordinate might to right, and that the principle of individual rights is an inductive principle that is formed as a result of thinking about this question, this issue, and there's a tremendous amount of historical knowledge and historical data that goes into this and about thinking about governments. And this is what Ayn Rand's approach in both if you take the two seminal essays of Man's Rights and The Nature of Government, they're grappling with and they're processing, and you get a very distinctive perspective. Now, to go into the details of that, you can read the book or read the essay, but that's the approach of it. And part of the goal is to get, so people who teach this, and who teach in particular Nozick, to get, Ayn Rand has a different view, and it might be useful to teach both of these together.
So you were mentioning that this is an aid for people who want to research and teach Ayn Rand's works, but I think it's fair to say that this is, while it's a scholarly book, it's very accessible. So if a student, an active student, whether an undergraduate or graduate student, or I think anyone who's at all interested in these issues, not being a student, just motivated, this is the material that they can access. It's challenging. I read a lot of the book already, and I found it really challenging in the way that your mind is growing. So I want to pick up on that.
Can I say something?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Harry.
Is this? Yeah, okay, there we go. If you weren't in objectivism in 1976 or politically aware, this was a revolution when that book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, came out. It won the National Book Award. It was a big sensation, covered in Time magazine. It's what legitimatized libertarianism or laissez-faire individualist point of view in academia. Before that book appeared, you could not ever say anything about a capitalism or individual rights or a voluntarily accepted human relationships. That was off the table. That was not serious. That was prohibited. When his book came out, it changed all that. And then there were all these courses on Rawls versus Nozick, and that's what made libertarianism an academically respectable movement. Now, where did it come from? Nozick's book. Nozick learned the basic ideas from Bruce Goldberg, someone I've barely heard of and you haven't heard of. Who was Bruce Goldberg? Bruce Goldberg was a person who was around in the outer circles of Ayn Rand. So it came from Ayn Rand to some secondary people. Goldberg, I think, was in the Rothbard camp, to Bruce Goldberg, to Robert Nozick. And it's scandalous that Nozick doesn't acknowledge more that this is just everything good in his book. Everything good in his book came from Ayn Rand, except a couple of cute examples. There is the phrase, the government should not prohibit capitalistic acts between consenting adults. I like that. That was good. And there's an example of Wilt Chamberlain. That was good. So he had some cute, witty stuff, but all the ideas that were valid came from Ayn Rand. He didn't acknowledge that.
Part of the issue. Part of the. Is it working now? I'll just talk more loudly. Part of the issue, though, is that Nozick doesn't always know which of his ideas are good. So I think he tries to acknowledge the things that he thinks of as from Rand and that he thinks of as even the footnotes or and so forth. But he doesn't. Nozick is to one of these people who is, I think, like the people I described earlier, who got something from Ayn Rand but doesn't understand it, and tries to defend capitalism in too conventional a way, and a way that's influenced by good things in the Locke tradition, but even doesn't get as good as the Locke tradition can be. And what Ankar's essay does is really bring out those differences as well as the similarities. And the key way this comes up is Nozick's book is posed as a response to an anarchist. So there are certain principles that we shouldn't use force on people and so forth. You might think those would lead to anarchism. And there are a lot of people who, due to an insufficiently deep understanding of Rand's political theory, and I think a lot of rationalism, came to be anarchists. And this is what Murray Rothbard and this kind of crowd represents. And Nozick sort of takes several steps down that road and then fights back. No, we wouldn't go to anarchism. We'd have instead this night watchman kind of state. And so he's coming from a position of having gone a number of the steps down the road to anarchism, understanding the foundations of liberty in a way that a lot of people reasonably think, if you understand them this way, would lead to anarchism, and then showing that even if you do that, you need a state. You can't have anarchism, but the state should be limited in various ways. What OCON does is show that those first steps are wrong, and this defensive posture against anarchism, like it seems like it should be anarchism, but it shouldn't, is all coming from a mistake. There's a kind of fundamentally different way of understanding where rights come from, what rights are, what government's role in protecting them is, that is in Rand, that is fresh in Rand, that is coming from the Enlightenment tradition, but a much deeper take on it than other Enlightenment influenced thinkers had, and the Enlightenment thinkers had themselves. And it should lead you to look at this issue very differently than the debate between Nozick and the anarcho-capitalists, as they call themselves, view it.
I wanted to pick up on the theme that we started with, which is situating Ayn Rand in the intellectual world, and particularly with relation to other thinkers who are seen as pro-freedom. And you've mentioned anarchism. So I've had the experience of meeting people who are economists, professors of economics, and discovering that they are actually politically anarchists and being taken aback by that. And then I've encountered lots of students who are interested in freedom, and they go to pro-freedom conferences, and once in a while I'll talk to them and I'll discover they're actually anarchists or anarcho-capitalism. And maybe I should not be surprised by this, but I continually find it surprising that anarchism is both a living thing in the sense it's an active going concern intellectually. So I was pleased that there's a whole discussion of this issue in the book. And Harry, I want to just turn to you and ask. So the one of the two contributions, I think one of your essays in there is a piece on anarchism, a critique of anarchism that Ayn Rand read and that she had a view on. So just maybe you can just give us a snapshot of what is your critique that she agreed with, and then what's the discussion you have with Humer, the scholar in the book who takes the other position.
My piece stems from an Ayn Rand Society meeting at which Michael Humer, a contemporary philosopher, and I think he was one of the winners of the essay contest on the Fountainhead, wasn't he? When he was young?
On OPAR, actually.
On OPAR? Okay. Who is now, he's not an objectivist in spades. I wouldn't call him an enemy. I don't think he thinks antagonistically, but he's so far in his thinking from the way you ought to think that it's hilarious if you read his piece. Anyway, there used to be an argument for anarchism. There used to be an intellectual argument from the anarchists for their position, and it was, we can't have monopoly. You have a right to compete. That applies to the government. Let's put government on the market. Where did the market come from? Well, the market's always there. So I wrote a piece answering that, showing why a competition in force is the opposite of a competition in producing values. And I don't know if it's, well, first of all, that was when I was working on the Objectivist Forum under Ayn Rand's supervision at a distance. She read the article after I had written it in galley form, and she said, well, have you gotten that out of your system now? Which I took to mean, yeah, it's all true. Everything you said is true. Why anyone would want to say it, I don't know. But because she considered anarchism childish. She used that word to describe it. So it had, she approved of it in that sense. She didn't have anything to criticize. And the argument that I gave may have silenced that argument for anarchism. Anyway, one doesn't hear that argument anymore. And now there's a more non-intellectual support for anarchism, which is governments always go bad. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely, but partial power turns into absolute power. Governments always go bad. Let's get rid of them altogether. So it's a very concrete bound argument because governments don't always go bad, or else we would still be in the Stone Age. Governments went good in 1776. Why is that? And why did it go bad from there? Well, because of altruism, of course, but they can't grasp that. That's way above their heads. So that's where the state of play is now on the issue of anarchism. It's not an argument for it. It's a kind of historical look with blinders on, looking back.
Well, there are a couple of different strands in what the contemporary anarchists are saying, and that is a major one. And it's I agree, silly. There's also versions of the argument you addressed that still have some currency, sadly, and a few other related arguments that are on the pattern of the one you addressed. And I think there's a lot, you can get a sense of what contemporary anarchist thinking is like from Humer's essay in this book. He's one of the shrewder of them. So it goes, well, that's just the position at its most cogent. Let's just say that much. And you have Harry's response to that. You also have the discussion by Ankar of Nozick and his response to anarchism, how Rands is different and deeper and not really even a response. It just cuts it off before it begins. And there's a lot of discussion of these issues in Darrell Wright's chapters too, kind of by the by, as he's responding to different alternative views. Also somewhat in Fred Miller and Adam Mossoff's chapter on rights, which we haven't talked about yet. Why so much on anarchism? Well, not too many pieces are on it, but it comes up in a lot of them. And the answer is, sadly, it is a huge deal among people who see themselves as defenders of liberty. Anarchism is to libertarianism as religion is to conservatism. And I think it's the real tragedy of the late 20th century, the 70s and afterwards, that the anti-statist movements of the time, the rejection of the statism that was, in the Soviet Union and so forth, and also the kinds of statism that we were finding in America in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations growing. When people rejected that, what did they turn to? And they didn't turn to a really deep, grounded understanding of Ayn Rand, even if she was inspiring them to value their lives and value freedom. They turned to intellectuals who packaged dealt freedom with either religion and tradition on the one hand, or with anarchy on the other. And those are those two movements. And you can find good elements in both of them, but it's really a tragic turn of events. And this book, I hope, will help the better people attracted to those movements sort out the package deals and sort out the real value of freedom and a real understanding of it from the material that it's become encrusted with in a lot of studies of it.
So one of the things I really found value in the book is the kind of thing you describe where you have a chapter and then there's a response from Humer and then a number of scholars are engaging in conversation about these topics. And I, on the slide, I put the list of contributors and some of you will recognize names, some of them are on the stage, but there are a number of people there that I think you would characterize as not objectivists. They wouldn't think of themselves as objectivists. They maybe more accurately think of themselves as libertarians, or I'm not sure how they would categorize themselves. But I think this is a real value in the book, that there's this engagement. So and earlier, Greg, you mentioned that some of these, and also you, Harry, you mentioned that your essay originated in ARS, Ayn Rand Society, thing. So, Robert, I want to turn to you. Tell us a bit about sort of the genesis of the book. What is the Ayn Rand Society? How does it fit in? I don't think a lot of people know about that.
All right. Well, first of all, the American Philosophical Association is the major professional organization for academic philosophers. And under their umbrella, there are a number of societies, and you have to apply to become an officially recognized society of the APA. And in 1987, Alan Gotthelf and a few others, they applied to create the Ayn Rand Society. And I remember I was a graduate student at the time, there was real doubts about whether this would fly at all. And it went fairly smoothly. And I think the official description of the purpose of the Ayn Rand Society is to foster the scholarly study of the philosophical thought of Ayn Rand. And the idea was, at least the ideal session the founders had in mind would be to have a really excellent objectivist philosopher present on some topic, and then have a non-objectivist comment or some session like that. So you're getting an engagement between an objectivist and a non-objectivist who is close enough so that there can actually be some kind of conversation. And Ayn Rand had the reputation, to put it mildly, among academic philosophers of she was kind of a lightweight egoist and capitalist. And so it was the intention of the founders to stay away from those topics at first, to show how deep and rich the objectivist philosophy is, Ayn Rand's philosophy is. So the first session was in '88. It was on sense perception. And then there was, the second was on the biological basis of teleological concepts. Who was that? No? Yeah, that was her. And then Alan Gotthelf led a session on metaethics, a topic in metaethics. And then there was, I think, George Walsh on Ayn Rand on Kant's metaphysics. So it took a while before we got beyond those topics. And not all of them fit the ideal. Sometimes we couldn't find, or I should say, I wasn't part of the steering committee yet. They couldn't find the non-objectivist. So there would be someone closer. And that's how it was. And we stayed away from politics at a certain point. I was on the steering committee. And I think the first session that was on political philosophy was in '97, the session on Darrell Wright's paper. But lately, I think 8 of the last 10 sessions or something like that were on political philosophy, particularly because we were looking for material to put in a volume on political philosophy. So that's how that goes.
Yeah, I have the sense that, so at a certain point we got this series, a contract with the press to produce a series of books, Ayn Rand Society Philosophical Studies. There have been 2 books prior to this one. I'm not going to remember the years on them, but the first one is on ethics. It's got one of these 3-part titles, which I have trouble remembering: Meta-Ethics, Egoism, and Virtue. In the business, we call it ARS-PS1.
2013, 2014.
Okay, so was 2013? I think it was earlier.
Well, that's what the website
Okay.
I looked it up.
Then the second book is Concepts and Their Role in Knowledge, and that collects papers on epistemology. And for both of those books, a number of the papers came out of Ayn Rand Society sessions that had been held at different times over the past 10, 15 years prior to this, and then some new things that were written for the volume or had been written for some other purpose but found their way into the volume. When we were looking for what to do after that, there's a book that's still in progress on Ayn Rand and Aristotle that will come out. I'm not sure exactly when yet, but most of the pieces are written for it. And we had the idea also that we wanted a book on political philosophy. We had stayed away from it for a long time with the society, but there's a ton written on it. There's this active libertarian movement in it. Rand's often mentioned in the literature on that and often not gotten right. And I at least had the feeling that we had kind of absented ourselves from the discussion on this material for too long, and it needed more of us in it. So I had made the case that we should have a book like this, and it was agreed that we should, and that we'll start making some sessions with an eye to that. And that led to this idea that I should edit the book, but I didn't want to edit it because it takes a long time to edit books, and I was worried that it takes me in particular a long time. And I thought Robert should be the one to edit this. He's really good at getting books out. He gets the best out of the authors. I really liked the books he'd edited up until that point. So I tried to talk him into doing it, and it turned out we'll do it together. So anyway, that's how we got to where we are. And we had a lot of the sessions Robert mentions over the past number of years on politics with an eye to this book. And we'll still have politics sessions from time to time, but we're back to now focused in our selection of topics on the topics that will power the next book, which is going to be on more issues related to character and some aesthetics and some issues in ethics.
So on the slide I've put divided by decades the list of books, scholarly books on Ayn Rand and objectivism. These do not include any books by Leonard Peikoff. I think rightly he's in a different class by himself, and they don't include the books, some of which you were involved with, which were like the Ayn Rand Answers book, which is taking material from Ayn Rand. And so these are exclusively scholarly academic treatments. And there's a lot under each of these 2 decades. And I've highlighted and read the 3 books that Greg mentioned in the Ayn Rand Society Philosophical Studies series, which you just recounted. In a letter to Anthem donors, Greg, which I read recently, you described the last 2 decades as a boom in a high-quality objectivist scholarship. So I just wanted to make that point for everyone to be aware. I think this is a really exciting time to be alive and to be interested, and there's so much material to read about Ayn Rand, and I think I've learned a lot from reading these books. You can see, I won't read them out, but you can glance over them. So I wanted to turn to you, Onkar. I've heard you talk about, so you've done a lot of thinking on the issue of how intellectual movements have operated in the past, what that might mean for the objectivist movement. And I wanted to bring out from you sort of your views about thinking about scholarly work and books in particular. What role have they played, and what role do you think they can play in helping advance the objectivist movement as an intellectual endeavor? You can shed some light on that.
I can say a little bit. I'm sure other people have as much to say.
Just bring the mic really close.
Is that good? Can you hear me in the back?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, they're vital to an intellectual movement. And one of Ayn Rand's advice about what can you do, the main advice for the professional intellectual is write. And it's in particular that you need books to fuel an intellectual movement. And you asked earlier about Nozick, and we were talking about Nozick and Rawls. It's not a coincidence that these two then became the people who were taught in political theory graduate school, because you have 2 significant books outlining and presenting in detail the arguments for their views. And that's, if you're going to have an intellectual movement that has impact, you need books to fuel it. And so that objectivist intellectuals have been writing more on these issues you say it's an exciting time. Partly it's an exciting time because you can't imagine the movement growing absent. I can't imagine it growing absent this kind of work. It might not grow. So this is not a fait accompli, but it's a necessary step. So I'm very positive that this is happening.
And if you were to have put a list so you have, the decades are 2000 to 2019 and 2010 to present. If you were to try to make a list like this for 90 to 2000 or 80 to 90, there'd be 2 books on the 90 to 2000 list, and one of them was 99. So it's practically 2000 already. Maybe I'm leaving one out, but it's just very little. So it's a lot of work from basically nothing for the decades prior of this sort. And there's been nothing in the form of full-length books, right? And I think that's an important step, that we're in a position to be working on this kind of thing. 3 books, I think, 90. All right.
Yeah, I would add that for the first time in the history of the objectivist movement, you have an excuse for not having read everything.
So just to underline the point, because we had a conversation at the office a few weeks back, maybe it was longer ago, and we were talking about looking at a parallel intellectual movement and what its scale was, and this was the progressive movement. So because I think this is a point that's easy to understate. So you guys know the progressive movement is not just in education, and it's not even in the last 10 years the way liberals have called themselves progressive, but progressive movement was a major phenomenon in the 20th century. Would Onkar or Harry, would you just summarize, what is the scale of their impact on the 20th century? How many people did they have? How many books did they publish? Because I think there's a real, you said, Onkar, that you said you can't imagine the movement, the objectivist movement, advancing absent this. So there's a necessary condition. Just give us the scale of what they looked like.
There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of intellectuals writing articles and articles and books and books and books. The scale of these things is pretty massive. It's the same. So the progressive movement through in the late 19th into the 20th century. There's a massive amount of intellectual work. And if you're thinking of this being taught in the universities, you need this kind of work. This is what they're drawing on when they're teaching classes and courses. And if there's not that, there's nothing to draw on. And you can't have that scale of impact. It's the same in the more chronologically moving forward and going again to Rawls. This is a point that Ayn Rand made about Rawls, and she could see what was coming, that you have a theory of justice, and then you're going to have a whole industry that is organized around it, and there's going to be essays and talks and courses and more books. I mean, I took a class on egalitarianism, and I mean, my professor had a book on it, and we're reading all kinds of articles, and then sometimes we would look at Rawls, but there was a massive literature on this one, egalitarianism. And that's what you need to have an intellectual movement with impact, and particularly that it's going to inject into the educational system.
So I think we have a mic in the back that's going to come around for those of you who want to ask questions. I'm going to put one brief question to each of you as we are waiting. People, you can raise your hands, and then the person with the mic will come find you. And Conrad, I'm going to leave it to you to pick who's next in the order, because yesterday I did this, and I think I almost created an argument among the people. So a quick question to each of you in a sentence or two. So one of the things that impressed me about this book and all the books on there is just how much depth there is and how much more there is to know and to do, how much scholarship there can be done on Ayn Rand and objectivism. So what are some issues that you would like to see done, not necessarily that you're going to do, but you think other scholars, young scholars coming up now could be invested in and do? So new scholarship on objectivism, what issues or areas would you like to see developed in the coming years? So do you want to start, Greg?
One that I mentioned yesterday in the Anarchism panel, and that comes up in passing in a few essays in this book, is it's in part a cultural issue and in part a political issue, which is the issue of racism. Most of what's been written about it and said about it by objectivists, at least a fair amount of it, is what's wrong with the leftist approach to it and why individualism is the solution to it. And I think that needs to be said, and it's important to be said. But if it's all you say, it sounds like you're just waving away the problem because the solutions people have are bad and wrong. But there is, I think, a lot of work to be done understanding why it's played the role in our history and society that it has, why it's become more prevalent at some times and diminished at other times over the course of world history and American history, what role various laws played in some of them being motivated by racism, as the minimum wage laws were, for example, to keep blacks out of the workforce, and which ones, whether or not they were motivated by racism, contributed to further racial stratification of the society, and just understanding the whole dynamic of racism as a cultural force and as a kind of model of a anti-individualistic attitude that's had a lot of horrible impacts on society and that's interacted a lot with political thinking. And particularly, there's this idea that we needed a kind of interventionist state to combat segregation and combat racism. And I think, in fact, that the interventionist state intervening in people's voluntary decisions in their business lives, in their personal choices, has sustained racism and made it a lot worse. And I'd like to see more articles exploring and proving that and developing that idea and saying, well, what then is the way to fight it? And what are the ways to fight the concrete challenges that are brought about by racism through better laws, through the right kind of movements and activism? So that's one example of something I'd like to see more done on. Harry?
I'd like to see more in the philosophy of science and all the sciences, philosophy of mathematics. I'm writing something on philosophy of economics, like Rob Tarr's work, but much more needs to be done. Philosophy of physics, philosophy of psychology. There's an area where we have a real leg up. The self-help movement and the clinical psychology movement is actually concerned with making people live better lives. Imagine that. I would think business, philosophy, and business management is an area where objectivism has a lot to offer, as John Allison and Jana Wojcicki have both been arguing. So I would like to see the philosophy of developed from an objectivist standpoint. I think the audience is more interested, and I think we can, I just think it's interesting and helpful.
I'll add one thing to that because I was going to say also philosophy of, but I would put the philosophy of history, and that an intellectual movement, I think, part of an intellectual philosophical movement has a perspective on history that helps people understand the whole development of history. And there's work, obviously, in objectivism of some periods, but to have an objectivist view, say, of the Renaissance, and understanding all the forces at work and what is going on. I mean, this is what the Marxists did. They give you a whole picture of history, and the religious traditions do that too. And you need that, I think, for the intellectual movement in objectivism.
Yeah, you've actually stole mine
Oh.
because, I would say the history of, you said the philosophy of history, but the history of philosophy from a proper perspective, there are these gems for the new intellectual that, I mean, I gave 2 lectures years ago just from really on trying to understand one line of Ayn Rand's about the Renaissance being, via Thomas Aquinas, being the product of Aristotle. And that contradicted what I was learning in graduate school, where I was told, it was just kind of a truism, that Aristotle was the philosopher of the Middle Ages, Plato was the philosopher of the Renaissance. And here Ayn Rand is contradicting that. It's a little non-essential. And so I spent a lot of time, but I'm not a medievalist. I don't know that period. I don't know those philosophers. So it would be great at one point if we have people working on, Locke scholars and Aquinas scholars and writing these chapters from a really a much superior view of the philosophy of history. I also think that just based on being here this week that it would be great if there was more work on aesthetics. I certainly agree. In fact, it stole part of my thunder, praising the work of Tora Buchman, but he's one guy. He's done some brilliant stuff, and I think there's a lot more work to be done. And I'll talk about this in my lecture on Aristotle. I find people too easily use the term romanticism to apply to visual arts, and it's not an easy thing to do. Ayn Rand's talking about literature, but how does that concept work, if it does at all, in these other fields? That's a really fascinating topic, and you really have to know the subject matter really well. So you have to know the objectivist aesthetic, but you also have to know music of the 19th century or sculpture or what have you. And so there's work to be done.
So let's turn it to audience questions. Raise your hand if you'd like the mic.
Can you tell us more about the sessions you had with the Ayn Rand Society behind this book, and who participated, and how many people came, and what groups, and if there are any highlights, from that discussion?
Well, I don't, I jotted down the ones that I was going to talk about today, but I don't know. There's been a lot of different sessions. There were, the 2 other books were largely based on earlier sessions. So the one on, the one on ethics, there's, for example, there have been 2 sessions which are author meets critic sessions. So they're a typical, and for 2 books by Tara Smith, we had, we'd bring in different people, some objectivists, some non-objectivists. They would each say something critical or commenting on the book, and then Tara responded to them. And that happened twice. And did both of those make it in, or only?
There have been 3 author meets critic
I
sessions
forgot the one
on Tara's. Material from the first 2 of them made it into the first book on ethics. There was an author meets critic section on her recent book on law that we had at one point wanted to include in this book also, but it was found that the book was just too long, and that ended up being published elsewhere in a journal. So it's you can find it, I think, in Reason Papers, but not in this book. If you go to the Ayn Rand Society's webpage, aynrandsociety.org, you can, you could donate money to the society if you like there, but also,
I was hoping we would plug that at some point.
Also, you can get a look at what all the different sessions we've had in the past are and who was involved in them. For this book, some of the papers derive kind of in far removed ways from sessions, like Darrell Wright's paper I mentioned before. But the main ones were, there was the session that Harry mentioned where Michael Huemer wrote a paper and Harry commented. Huemer was in part in his paper referencing an earlier work Harry wrote, and which Harry mentioned in the piece that he wrote in The Objectivist. So we included that paper in the book. Sorry, The Objectivist Forum. Thank you, Harry. And so we included that earlier piece of Harry's in the book, along with the exchange between Huemer and Harry at this session. There was a session in which we had two papers on Rand and Nozick. One was the paper of Ankar's, which I alluded to, or which we talked about already. Another was a paper by Lester Hunt, who is someone who's sometimes on the steering committee of the Ayn Rand Society. We rotate through who's on the committee. And Lester, I don't think, would call himself an objectivist. I don't think I'd call him one, but he's someone who's very interested and knowledgeable about and sympathetic about Rand. So not someone who just has a passing acquaintance. And he was writing a book on Nozick, and so he contributed a chapter on Rand and Nozick. So both of those pieces, the one by Lester Hunt, the one by Ankar on Nozick, come from a session. And then there was a session where, Ankar's chapter on religion, freedom of religion, was part of that actually derives from an OCON talk he gave some years ago. And then there was an Ayn Rand Society version of it, which is a more scholarly version of the talk. That was at a conference where there was also a presentation by a historian talking about some of the same issues and for reasons overlapping with other things the historians published. That his piece isn't in the book, but Ankar's is. And there was a session then on Ayn Rand's theory of rights, where the paper presented was by Fred Miller and Adam Mossoff. Adam's at the conference now. I'm not sure if he's in the room today. But anyway, explaining Ayn Rand's theory of rights and defending it against some criticisms that have emerged out of the libertarian literature. The commentator on that paper at the time, at the session, was Matt Zwolinski, who is one of the people who calls himself a bleeding heart libertarian. We can talk about what that movement means if you like. But anyway, the bleeding heart libertarian, Matt Zwolinski, who's a professor of political philosophy and ethics and of some stature in the field. And he gave a commentary with some critique of Fred and Adam's paper and of Ayn Rand's position as he understood it, both from Fred and Adam's paper and from his earlier reading of it. And Fred and Adam made some remarks in response at the session, but they, for reasons of other commitments, didn't want to write a reply to Zwolinski for the book, and I had a lot to say about those issues. So I ended up writing a long paper, which is too long to count quite as a reply to him, but is a continuing on of that discussion and some of the issues he raised. So that paper of mine wasn't presented at a session, but the paper by Fred and Adam and by Matt were at a session. And there was also a session on comparing Rand's view of free markets to philosophical defense of free markets to other views of free markets. And the paper by Butke that's in there is derives from that session. Well, I've mentioned Zwolinski. I should mention one other thing that's come out of this book that I see as, anyway, it's happened, and I see it as a suspicious development. I don't know if I've told all of you guys about this yet, which is that Zwolinski is editing for Routledge Press a companion to libertarianism that's going to discuss all the different views that are or are thought of as libertarian and the kind of debates that happen among people who view themselves as libertarian on different policy issues. And he's asked me to write an 8,000-word essay on objectivism as part of that, which I've agreed to do.
It's good.
I'd like to ask how long did it take to write the book, and what can be done to accelerate these scholarly books coming out? And third part is, what can we who are not philosophers could do besides just donating money to ARI? Like, can we bookmark donations to scholarly book projects?
Too long, I don't know. And I was supposedly brought on to answer the, to make sure the deadlines were met and all that. But for a number of reasons, largely at the end involving the press and certain surprises they threw at us, it took a lot long. I forget when the project began exactly, but it went on longer than expected. But
I think it was around late 2012, early 2013 when we decided that we wanted a book like this. I know where I was living. I remember
And
where I
Alan
was
was
when I
still
was
around.
on the
Alan
conference
was still
call, and it was with
alive.
Alan Gotthelf, and we were arguing a bit about it and about who should edit it. So I have a recollection of that call. I was living in Boston. It was either 2012 or 2013. We thought we could knock it off relatively quickly, and having Robert on board would make it, we'll just get this done right away. It took us a lot longer than we thought to have a book to send to the press. Then after we sent it to the press, we thought, as with the previous books in the series, that the editorial board was serving as the reviewers of the manuscript, so that once we submitted it, they would just say, okay, and publish it, and it would get copy edited and a few other things, and we thought we were underway. But it turned out that the press policy had changed, and they needed to send it out to external reviewers, which we didn't anticipate. That took some months to do that we weren't expecting, and then we hadn't factored into our planning of what work we had to do, and none of the authors had, that there were going to be responses to these reviewers and editing things in terms of it. And so basically it took more than a year longer than we thought, even after having taken longer than we had hoped because of these complications with the press.
Yeah, anyway, the second part was just like, so what can be done to accelerate these scholarly books coming out, and what can we, who are not philosophers, can do, besides just donating money to ARI? Can we bookmark donations, particularly for this kind of project?
Well, there's the Anthem Foundation. Robert, you're on the board.
That doesn't mean anything. So there's the Anthem Foundation, which you can, the Anthem Foundation usually has projects in mind, and then, they're real projects or real scholars working on certain things, and they go looking for money for those projects. So Greg sent out an email recently. Was that recently, or the one you referred to?
Yeah,
Fairly recently, updating the project.
I'm not remembering what email you're telling me about. So.
An email that went out to donors.
Yeah, to the donors. So keep an eye out for those. That's one way that I can't speak to what ARI may fund, but people can earmark.
The best way I think is
to the Anthem Foundation. I think.
And you've received, some of your books.
Yeah, a lot. And I've had two sabbatical periods that were supported by research grants from ARI. This is before I was on the board of directors. I don't know if that would have been a problem, but and during those periods, I published. I produced books as a result. In the last one, the last sabbatical I had, the main reason I applied for money from ARI was to finish the book on the Unconquered. But I also was beginning a book on Aristotle's lost Homeric problems and another book on Theophrastus. And so all of those books I thanked ARI for it. And I always liked the fact that one of them was an Oxford University Press, someone opening it up and not expecting to see the Ayn Rand Institute mentioned. And there it is. And I kind of like
I should say
that idea about that.
A word, though, about the ways in which donating money to these organizations helps and the ways in which they've supported these books, because it's not an accident that all of these books started coming out at the time that they did. And it's shortly after the Anthem Foundation was founded, the BB&T charitable arm supporting a lot of programs for the study of objectivism. There was one, Robert's already mentioned, it's funded release time for people to work on projects. And a lot of my time which I spend working on these things, is paid for by Anthem, and I wouldn't have that time to work on these projects. So it's paying some of our salaries and releasing us from teaching or other commitments we'd have that would be in tension with spending time on the books. But also, and equally importantly, we talked about the role of the Ayn Rand Society sessions in making in generating some of the papers for these books and some of the discussions that led to some of the ideas in these books. The Ayn Rand Society sessions have been taking place, once a year, more or less, from the 90s, and it would be two people talking at the session. What we started having in the early 2000s as a result of first Tara's Anthem Fellowship at Texas, she organized a lot of sessions, and Alan Gotthelf organized a ton of things when he was at Pittsburgh and then at Rutgers, is workshops where we brought together people to try out ideas, to discuss things, to work issues through. There was none of this, or hardly any of this, prior to Tara starting to run them with the money that she got from the Answer Foundation and from BB&T, and then Alan doing it. Sometimes it would be bringing a bunch of objectivists together to work through an issue that we were a little confused about, or that all of us wanted to write about, or that we had papers to comment on in draft. Sometimes it would be bringing some objectivists and some non-objectivists together to discuss an issue. Sometimes they'd be formal conferences. Sometimes they'd be little workshops. But I can't count. I mean, I could if I worked at it, but I can't off the top of my head tell you how many things like this there have been over the past, since about 2000. But several of them a year, and a growing number of them. Now we have funds from Anthem at Rutgers that I'm involved in organizing, usually 2 events a year. Sometimes more than that. Tara's still doing them. There have been other events like this of other sorts. There's the Clemson Institute, conferences on capitalism. All of these kinds of events are taking place with objectivist intellectuals at them, sometimes interacting with other people. And that fervor of intellectual activity has made a lot of these books happen that wouldn't otherwise happen, and have made all of them better than they would otherwise have been. And that is what the donor support makes possible.
I want to just add to that briefly. So I'll speak for the Ayn Rand Institute, and I appreciate all of those of you who are donors to the Institute. But there's one way in which I think maybe underappreciated. So if you think this is what's been done in the last 20 years, just scholarly books, and there's other books we can talk about, but what's going to happen in the next 20 years? And I would love this list to fill several slides. And for that to happen, the Ayn Rand Institute needs your help, and you'll hear more about that from Tal this afternoon. But a big part of what we do at the Ayn Rand Institute is train new intellectuals, and Onkar is leading that. The Objectivist Academic Center is the main vehicle through which we train new intellectuals. And there has to be, we were talking a bit about what it looks like for an intellectual movement to grow, and the big part of that is producing content, producing new scholarship. If you go downstream from that, it means cultivating, finding, and training intellectuals and scholars who are competent and energized to do that kind of scholarship down the road. And that doesn't just happen. People need to bring their own motivation, but the training is intense and it takes a lot of time. And your support to the Institute helps to make that possible. So if you're thinking about how to make more of these books possible, I would say, please do consider what the Ayn Rand Institute is doing to train new intellectuals. I think that is one of we have a lot of mission critical projects because we have a big mission. That one really rises to the top of the list in my view, because it's an investment in the future of new intellectuals, which means in the growth and spread of objectivism as an intellectual movement. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah. Not only that, it's not only the training that a person would get, but the people who can have intellectual careers because of the Institute. There are people, Elan, where would you be if you didn't have employment at the Institute? You know, Onkar. Yes. Last night I suggested Onkar be working at the post office. Greg is getting funded by Anthem for a part of his career. And there are just so many people that can pursue this career in which they get trained. Aaron in the back there, because there is a place now. There's a think tank for objectivists. And if you look back at past conferences in the 80s and so forth, the courses were very long. There might be 8 lectures in a course. One of the reasons for that was that there weren't many intellectuals to give courses. So each one had to give a lot more hours. Now we're jockeying for position because there's so many people who can give courses at a conference. So there's been a tremendous growth in the number of people who can write and who can have a life as a public intellectual thanks to your donations.
Well, we are at time, so I'm sorry we don't have time for more questions. I want to thank you all for being here today, and thank you for your interest in this project.
Thanks for watching. To help keep content like this free, consider supporting ARI by becoming a member at aynrand.org/membership.